All right, I think we'll get started, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Shush, Bryn. So today we're going to talk about the Pinto module, efficient theming for front and back end developers. So really quickly, most of you know me, lead developer at PreviousSnext. I've actually been doing Drupal for 44% of my life now. I'm about to turn 36, so you can do the maths. You've definitely seen me on Drupal.org on Slack. I'm pretty prolific there, and I'm a core subsystem maintainer for block content and the node modules. And that's my doggy. So, Pinto is the most efficient way to theme Drupal sites. That's from me right now. So let's hopefully explain why. So a bit of story time first. Paint a picture of what Pinto is aiming to solve, and maybe to convince you to give it a go. So let me know if this sounds familiar to you. You're working on a Drupal site, your front end builds a new component in your design system that you now need to implement in Drupal. You create maybe a new paragraph type or a block content type, and you use a mixture of twig templates, field formatters, pre-process hooks, all the bells and whistles to replicate the design system markup as closely as possible. Maybe there's a couple of extra wrapping divs, a couple of classes that you don't need, but it works and you move on. And then a few years later you come back and you need to make a slight change. Maybe the button needs a new class to make it red or something like that. And it takes you like 2 hours to remember how everything fits together, because the logic's between 3 different twig templates, some YAML for a config of a field formatter, a pre-process hook, and it takes you a while to figure out what's going on. Imagine if you could just reuse that template that your front end had built directly from your design system, and imagine if you could have all that logic just in one location and for rendering that component in a single place. So that's kind of what Pinto aims to accomplish. So what is Pinto? It's a module written originally by Daniel Finn, one of our developers at PNX, and it unlocks a new paradigm for theming Drupal sites. A couple of years ago I wrote a blog post, two blog posts actually, on the PNX site with lots of code examples and detail on how to set it up. And on the right, which is probably more beneficial for you now, the blog posts are a little bit outdated, but you can kind of see how we've evolved over the years. Dan's written a really great set of documentation which will kind of guide you through how to use Pinto. So what is Pinto? You define components in regular old PHP classes, and Pinto basically does all the heavy lifting for you to actually render a component. Because they're PHP objects, all of our theme variables or slots or props, whatever you want to call them, can be strictly typed with PHP typing, and Pinto can really easily integrate with tools like Storybook or another design system to reuse templates directly from them. So you're eliminating duplicated markup, and you're encapsulating all of your logic into a single place, which is your Pinto component or PHP class. And you can reuse these components all across your website, nest them, and place them wherever you want. So Pinto is really highly focused on the developer experience, reducing boilerplate, improving reusability, improving maintainability. You basically define a component and automatically everything behind the scenes is created for you. You're not interacting with render arrays, you're not messing around with YAML, and rendering a component will automatically attach anything that you've told Pinto that is required. So CSS, JavaScript, dependent libraries from other modules or themes, things like that. So it's perfect for things rendering component-based entities like paragraphs, blocks, media, custom entities. You can easily integrate it with Layout Builder, with block plugins, or block content entities. It even integrates with Canvas. It's not a public module yet. There's been a few road bumps to get that working, but we hope to release something later this year. And we're always evolving. So like I said, I wrote a couple of blog posts a couple of years ago, and the changes from then to now are pretty staggering in terms of how easy it is to use and automating as much of the process as possible. So what isn't Pinto? It's not a Pinto bean. It really excels at sort of lower level components. So if you're familiar with atomic design, it's things like atoms, molecules, and organisms. There's a Pinto layout module, so you can define layout plugins as Pinto components. And you can certainly use it for theming entire pages for custom controllers and things like that. But for content manageable pages like a node, you're best to stick with Layout Builder for the whole page, and then render the innards of the page with Pinto. And there's no integration with Form API or anything like that yet. So how do we actually use Pinto? There's a simple 3-step process. You create a component, you tell Pinto about it, and then you use it wherever you want. So there's a link there for a quick start guide on the documentation page that Dan wrote. But let's kind of step through what that looks like here. So creating a component. Here's like a sample component that I had to build with Pinto recently. One of my clients wanted. Pretty straightforward. On the left, you've got like a WYSIWYG area, headings, text, buttons, sort of thing. On the right, we've got an image, but they also wanted to be able to have the ability to reverse. So the image is on the left, the text is on the right, and they wanted to be able to set the image to like a 1/3 width, so it's a slightly different layout. So let's imagine that your front-ender builds a twig template like this. So for our 2 bits of content and 2 sort of control variables, we have 4 theme variables all up. We've got the third variable, whether the image is going to take up a third or not, the reverse, whether the image is going to be on the left or the right, and then content and image, all pretty straightforward stuff here. So before we look at how we'd build this with Pinto, let's maybe think about how we might do this normally. Maybe, I don't know, it's been a while, but maybe a twig template for a block content type with a preprocessor to inject the top 2 variables, and maybe you find some field formatter to wrap the WYSIWYG field in a special div with a class, and same with the image. In Pinto, we just create a PHP class. So we make a featured content class, and we basically have 1 constructor parameter per twig variable. So we had the 4 variables in the twig template. So we have 4 constructor variables. And that attribute right at the top there, the slots attribute, is basically telling Pinto, hey, take each one of these constructor parameters and register them as theme variables for this particular component. So slots can be anything. In this case, we've got some content, which is like a markup object. We've got an image, which is another Pinto object called an image. And then we've got 2 booleans for those 2 kind of control variables, just depending, that controls where the image sits and how wide the image is as well. And then finally, we've got this trait, the Drupal invocable slots trait, and that comes from the Pinto module. And that basically handles everything else for us. When we render this component, it's going to turn it into a render array for us. It's going to take all those constructor parameters and put them into the right place in the theme object, definition, attach libraries, and attach cacheable metadata as well. So now we've got our component, we've got our twig template. Now we need to tell Pinto about our component, so we just need to register it. So you can either register it manually, or there's automatic discovery. Pinto discovers components by default via an enum list. If you don't know what an enum list is, it's just another PHP object that you add a case to, and you map that case to the component itself. So by default, Pinto looks for enums in the Pinto namespace, so you can have a module. You can break up your components per module if you want. You can have like a design system module. It's really up to you. It's very flexible in how things are structured and sort of how you want to set it up. There's also actually a trait that you can use that'll mimic the single directory component setup. So if you want, if you like that sort of setup where everything related to a component's encapsulated in a directory, you can do that as well. And there's a little bit more flexibility around how that's set up. But in this talk will mainly be talking about the enum discovery. And we'll also talk about STCs a bit more later as well. Cool, so this is what registering the component in an enum looks like. This is the more complicated case, so usually it's a couple of lines. The definition attribute at the top just tells Pinto this case, this featured content case, ties to the featured content class that we showed before. Then we've got like a custom attribute, so you can do custom logic in your Pinto discovery. So in this example, we've got like an SB component attribute, and that tells Pinto where the twig template is in relation to our storybook setup. So we sort of had this directory structure of components, and then you can attach things like CSS and JavaScript via attributes as well. So in this case, it's telling Pinto that this component depends on the featured content CSS, and Pinto is going to automatically create a library for you with that CSS file. If you also give it JavaScript files and things like that, it's going to set up a library for you. And then when you render the component, it's going to attach them automatically as well. Cool, and now we're all set to use our component. We can use it anywhere in Drupal that supports render arrays. At the end of the day, Drupal deals with render arrays when it's going to render some markup. So Pinto just kind of is a way of not writing a render array and instead using a component and getting it automatically turned into a render array for you. So you can use it in controllers, block plugins, field formatters, anything really. So rendering a component looks something like this. So we build the component, we create a featured content class, we pass in the 4 variables that we defined, so some markup, an image, and our booleans, and then we just call the component or invoke it. So at the bottom there, build equals component with the brackets there is invoking the component, and that output of that would be a render array. So if you don't know what invoking is, it's actually just, there's nothing, well, it is kind of magical. It's a magic method in PHP, and the term relates to the fact that you're calling an object as a function. So those brackets there, when you invoke an object, you're just calling it as a function, and that's not a requirement of Pinto, but that's sort of what we've standardized on. It's what we find easy. So using Pinto's traits will sort of automate all this for you. You don't really have to worry about it, but I really wanted to describe how this all works so you can sort of understand the concepts a bit easier and relate it to things you've already been using. So invoking that featured content component is going to spit out something like this. Again, you'd never deal directly with the render array, but you can see like it's generated a theme definition for us. It's put the things in the right variables, it's attached a library, it's added some casual metadata, and we don't have to think about any of this. We just create an object and Pinto does everything for us. So I touched a little bit on how we use Storybook. Our front-enders use Storybook, they build everything in Storybook, and then we just steal all the twig templates and use them in Drupal. So let's quickly talk about Storybook there to set some context. So at PNX we use Storybook on basically every project. Anything with a custom theme, we'll build a design system for the client, and that's a really good way of giving the front-enders a place to build and document components in isolation. There's no requirement for them to interact with or understand Drupal. Our clients can play with and test the components in Storybook before anything gets written in Drupal. And we use it for everything from a simple icon on the left to a React-based graph on the right. And this is an example of the Cancer Australia website that went live earlier this year. We built the entire site from the ground up using Pinto and Storybook, and yeah, let me tell you, it was pretty quick. So with our Storybook setup, we have like a components directory at the root of our repository. Storybook will use that to generate its stories to serve that display like I showed before. And then we use the components module, the Drupal module, to define a custom twig namespace. And we point that to our Storybook directory. And then we have that attribute that I showed earlier that tells Pinto where the component is in relation to the storybook directory. Cool, so we've made our component. How do we actually use it in something that's useful? We all deal with rendering entities in Drupal. Most of the time that's how content gets displayed on the page. So yeah, using Pinto to render entities is sort of where the module really starts to shine. You're no longer messing around with display settings or overriding twig templates. You just wire up the component and you're kind of set to go. So there's a couple of modules you can use to do this. As I said, things have been evolving over the years. And really, realistically, if you were going to use Pinto to start rendering entities, you really need to be using bundle classes. By now, if you're not doing that, it's probably one of the best features of modern Drupal, so get on top of bundle classes. Bundle class attributes, it's not a requirement, but it lets you define where your bundle classes are using an attribute rather than having to use an alter hook, and it's actually a core feature coming in 11.4. And then there's two options to sort of route your rendering to Pinto land rather than normal Drupal land. So you can use one I wrote last year for the conference. It's called Bundle Class View Builder. So it lets you choose bundles on entity types. Choose entity types that you want to enable this sort of rendering system through. Or you can use Pinto entity, which is a bit more Pinto focused. And that's the one we're going to focus on looking at today. Both of these modules are pretty much zero config setups. You just drop them in and then you just define things on your bundle class to use them. So with BCVB, you've got the module ships with an interface. If a bundle class implements that interface, then the rendering of an entity of that bundle will just be diverted to a build method. And with Pinto entity, it's very similar, but you define the method with an attribute instead. And if either of those don't build the entity, it'll just kind of fall back to normal Drupal rendering. So you can have things like, for media entities, for example, the media library view mode just falls back to normal rendering. You don't really want to bother with that. You just want to be able to render, an image in the front end with your specific setup. All right, so with the Pinto entity module, this is an example of setting up a featured content paragraph bundle class, for example. All you need to have to tell Pinto entity to render the bundle class with our Pinto component is a method with this entity view attribute. And now all your rendering of that entity in the default view mode is going to go through this method. And all we're doing is returning our featured content component. And yeah, it looks pretty small, and that's because it is. It's all kind of encapsulated in other things. So for this example, we've got this sort of featured content create from featured content entity, which is like a factory method to translate from an entity to the Pinto component. So we're sort of building up the layers here. Hopefully you're still following along. Cool. So let's kind of look at what that factory method might look like. And in this case, my client wanted to be able to use both paragraphs and blocks for the same component. So we didn't have to build the rendering twice. We just use one Pinto component, set up a trait that's shared by two bundle classes, and we basically take the entity, pass it into the constructor of the component, that then gets translated automatically by Pinto into a render array, and then sort of everything else is sort of done for us. We do this once, and now we've got both paragraphs and blocks. You can see the type hinting on the entity sort of allows two different object types. And because we've used the Drupal invocable slots trait, everything's sort of, once we invoke that object, it's going to turn into that render array, take all the info from the entity, add the cacheable metadata, add our CSS file, and we're all done. So quickly looking at sort of the difference between rendering with Pinto and rendering through core system. I don't know if you've ever stepped through the rendering lifecycle from the moment like a view is called on an entity to the end, but it's pretty long. There's a lot going on there. And if you've got Layout Builder, it sort of does it all again for various reasons that we're trying to fix. But yeah, if you're using Pinto, you sort of sidestep everything. So you get your entity, and it just gets rendered with exactly what you want. So you're removing all those middlemen and just getting sort of the markup that you know you need. So sort of the elephant in the room, I guess. Why not SDCs, single directory components? They're the new hot thing on the block, and why didn't we go for it? And look, there's quite a few reasons, so let's talk about it. First of all, I don't know anyone that likes writing YAML. I certainly don't. It's pretty easy to mess up. Whereas in Pinto, you've got the full power of the PHP language. You're using real enums, you're using real strict typing, not some sort of JSON schema that doesn't actually get validated at render time. Pinto actually will give you errors, meaningful assertions on what you've passed into the objects. So when you're developing these components, you know things aren't going to break, or you haven't got the name of a property incorrect by one character or whatever. As you hopefully saw, rendering a Pinto component is pretty easy. You just create an object and that's about it. But I only found this out a couple of weeks ago, but rendering an SDC, you have to manually create the render array, or with the twig embed, the twig include is all sort of manual effort. And nesting SDCs starts to look pretty messy. There is a way to integrate Storybook with SDCs. There's a Storybook module, but it's sort of like backwards to how I think Storybook should be used, where Storybook is the source of truth and Drupal is consuming it. It's the other way around, because SDCs have to live in Drupal modules, and then you're using Drush to sort of generate these things, and I don't know, it's sort of backwards to me. Whereas, like I said, Pinto can just grab a template from where you tell it to using the components module, or any custom way you want to set it up, and it just sort of works. There's a lot more flexibility in Pinto as well. You don't have to just have one CSS, one JavaScript file named exactly the same as your component in a single directory. You can kind of just do whatever you want, have it everywhere. It'll just kind of pull everything in that you tell it to, and away you go. And there's a really flexible asset system as well, and it'll even make sure the assets exist that you tell it to use. But if you do like SDCs, as I said, there's an SDC mode or a discovery method. If you really like that sort of everything in one directory approach, Pinto can do that as well, and actually you could use both. So that's all documented again on the docs page there. And looking ahead on the Pinto roadmap, obviously the big one on the cards for us is integration with Canvas. We want to make sure our tools are compatible with the new hot thing on the block. So Canvas is very tightly coupled to SDCs, and there's been a few speed bumps and API changes along the way that have made it a bit more tricky, but we have got sort of working integration with Canvas, and we'll hopefully be releasing that to the community later this year. And really it's, with each release of Pinto, we're just making things easier and easier to use, pulling in patterns that we use at PNX and making them available as traits in Pinto, and making that developer experience easier and easier. And if you do end up trying it out, let us know what you want. You might think in good improvements. Always keen to hear. So that's it.
That sounds really cool. I think last year in DrupalSouth we talked about this.
Briefly, as a lightning talk,
Yeah. Because I heard about it and I thought that looks good. I need to look into that and haven't touched it since.
That's totally fine. I won't hold it against you.
It's great that it's gone way further along.
Yes.
Yep. If you could go back to the screen where you rented. Stop.
This one?
Yes.
Yes.
That you've got a featured content track there.
Yes.
To your component.
Yep.
And featured content.
Yep.
Are those, well, the track, for instance, is that generated by Pinto system?
No, so this is like, that's like a trait that, so generally on bundle classes, we'll have like getters and setters. So that trait is defining these methods here, and then they're reused by both bundle classes. You could just have like, you know, entity arrow, body arrow value if you don't want to have, we just like to be a little bit fancy, so we have these like nice APIs where you get body, but you could totally just do it old school and pass in the value directly.
I mean, traits is pretty improvement, but if you had to make one for every component, you're going to make it.
Yeah, it's up to you how you structure it. You don't even really have to have that level of abstraction. You could just go return new featured content and then pass the values in manually. We just like, the way I like to set it up is have the factory method on the component, because then it's like the component knows how to translate an entity to itself. So in my head, it works, nice little architecture, and then your bundle class is nice and neat, and yeah. Anyone else?
Can components set dependencies on other components, so like assets around in right order?
Yeah, well, it's all like, so you've got your CSS and JavaScript definitions. You can also, there's also, I should have actually had this in the slide, you can have like dependency on. So it'll be like, that'll translate to a library dependency. So the Pinto will create the library, and then it will say that's a dependency on another library. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is great. Through here, looked at it last year.
No worries.
It's amazing. Question about the formatters, integration, and any new models. Have you thought about this? Basically, talking about being able to configure the UI.
Right.
The mapping of fields of the entity to a field within the classes. I don't know how that would work actually.
I know what you're saying. It's possible, yeah. So you could, so instead of having to codify it all, like something in the UI that would say this field goes to this slot.
More around the fact that some fields could be represented on the render side of things with formatters.
Right.
If you get, I don't know, FS field or something like that.
Yeah.
There's different formatters. And if you want to use the formatters output somehow,
Yeah.
You would set it within the UI itself.
Right. Yeah.
The entity view mode.
Yeah.
How would that be translated to these properties?
Yeah.
Bundle classes, or would it?
Yeah, you could. So sometimes in like our component definition where we've got the props here, like these are essentially props, right? You can just have an array as the type, and then you can chuck in whatever render array you want. So there have been moments where maybe it's an address field or something like that, some complex field that I don't want to have to recreate. We've already got a formatter there that does most of what I want. And you can just call a view method on the field, pass in your settings, and then pass that render array directly to a component. But being able to do that through some sort of UI or something is an interesting idea. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Just the registering component for this one of the cube, is that in the class where you find
It can be, actually. It's like, there's lots of different ways. So yeah, all the methods of discovery are on the contrib social page. But in this scenario, this is on an enum. So you have like an enum in the Pinto namespace of any module you want. You can also have custom namespaces if you want. And each case, so a case on an enum is like one, single, maps to one single component. And then you can have logic in the enum for things like template discovery and stuff if you want. So you can think of the enum as sort of like the Pinto registry, and that's how Pinto sort of discovers components and things like that.